Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter with Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim, I see you're already on there, but I want to give some guidelines to our dear participants. We want to appreciate everyone, our sponsors and partners who have made it possible for us to bring the Global Market Encounter all from the beginning of this year till this moment, which happens to be the last session of the Global Market Encounter for 2022. And want to appreciate CNFA Pro Cashew, GIZ Move, Intersnack, Sustainability, SNI, and many others. Please note that this session is being held in English with a simultaneous French interpretation. To access this service, kindly click on the globe icon on your screen, select a preferred language, and mute the original sound. If you have any questions or need for clarification as the presentation is ongoing, please use the Q&A feature and we'll address them after the presentation. Without taking much time, join you welcome Jim Fitzpatrick. Jim?
Morning, Blessing, how are you? Good morning, everyone. Or good afternoon. You're very welcome to our last session of 2022, number 16, number 45 in this series. Today we're going to, as we always do at the end of the year, we're going to take a look at looking back and reviewing 2022, and we will have a look at what kind of trends we're going to watch during 2023. It's been another unusual year, to say the least. It's interesting just to take stock, have a look backwards and look forwards. Joining us today, we will have Andrei Tanjikpon of the Consultative International Cashew Council, the CICC, and we're going to ask Andrei about his thoughts on the past year and what he thinks might happen in the coming year. So before we do our review, let's have a quick look, and it's only a very quick look today, at the market indicators over the past 2 weeks. We haven't seen a great deal of change in the prospects for the crops. We haven't seen a great deal of change in the RCN trade either. It looks as if Vietnam is reasonably well supplied for now. It looks like India might need some more product, but if we look at the Tanzanian auction as an indicator, we see that progress remains relatively slow, given that we're already into December. Kernels trade has picked up though, perhaps not yet in big volume trades, but certainly in interest and certainly in the level of discussion as to what's going on for next year. And I think that applies in all markets, perhaps with the exception of India, where just right now the trade appears to be a little bit flat post the major festivals. That means really for 320 prices, although we have seen the market steady up a little, we haven't seen that big move out of the range just yet. Prices relatively similar to where they were 2 weeks ago. Overall, I guess we could say that the kernels market looks steady, and it looks as if we could see, although a relatively quiet end to the year, could be quite an interesting start to 2023. So let's look back and let's ask the question, what was new in 22? And I'm going to take a look at a series of trends and a series of events that shaped the course of the market during 2022. And I think the first thing was, it's easy to forget, actually, isn't it, now towards the end of the year, just how impactful the COVID-19 pandemic was. And that it's not so long ago for most of us that lockdowns were a feature of everyday life. And they still are in some parts of the world. In China, for example, we still see a big impact of the effort to control COVID-19. So during 2022, I just point to four major factors, four major impacts of COVID-19. Firstly, the impact on demand from China and the slowdown of buying in China, particularly early in the year, when it has, as a market, a huge impact on the pattern of trade in Vietnam. But secondly, we look at the impact of inflation and the fears of inflation, primarily caused by COVID-19, I mean, I think that you can't spend hundreds of billions in markets in the world without expecting some kind of inflation to follow. And that's exactly what we've got, although it seems to be moderating now. Third factor, and it's still with us, is the impact on inventory, the impact on shipments and logistics. Some people's inventories ran low early in the year and they topped them up. Others found that as the year went on, they had enough and they decided to slow down their buying. So it's had a huge impact, and it still has a huge impact. And it remains to be seen whether freight rates will ever return to those kind of rates we become used to back in 2019. The final factor is, of course, the impact on buying patterns. We did see during the year, particularly in the US, a major interruption to buying. And this was based on a number of factors, the level of inventory, but mostly the level of uncertainty and fears for the future in the marketplace. On a more optimistic note, second big trend in 2022 was growth in cashew consumption in India. India has really come back. If you were with us 2 weeks ago, you will have heard Mr. Amit Pai talk to us about Indian demand, a shift in consumption, people looking for the healthier option in their choices of snacks, a very strong gifting season. We heard how cashew nuts in India are part of the culture and how we are returning to levels of growth which haven't been seen since certainly prior pandemic and maybe a little bit before that. So it looks as if we are going to see a continuation of growing demand in India. And if we look at the figures, and we've looked at these every couple of weeks for the past 3 or 4 months, we see record levels of imports into India. So I think we can look forward to further increase in demand in India. Third trend this year has been a return to production growth after an interruption during the pandemic. Certainly we've seen a renewed vigor in production in Africa, but we want to try and put that into a global perspective. And 2022 was a really good year to do that because it showed us very clearly the trends around the world. We can see that the fast growth in Africa, especially West Africa, which has been the driver of production growth for more than a decade now, that has begun to slow a little bit. We didn't see the same level of growth in recent years as we'd seen in the years post-2010. If we look in India, we see growth, but it's very slow, less than 2% per annum increase in production. As Amit told us last time, we've also seen the movement of production north and east, and that takes time, and it will take time for production growth to return. We see in Vietnam effectively no growth in production, and that's been the case for some time, as we can see if we look at Vietnam. Apart from fluctuations due to growing conditions, weather and climate, we see very little growth, and that's set to continue. But the driver of production growth worldwide has been Cambodia. So if we look at this situation, Cambodia has added around about 700,000 tons to the market over the past 10 years or so, and most of that, about 500,000 tons, has been added in the last 3 years. So this has been a huge trend. Now there is a question mark over that. In 2022, we saw a lower crop in Cambodia due to weather conditions. We also hear discussion in Cambodia about some farmers planting, but other farmers taking out cashew trees to plant more lucrative fruit trees, which are targeted on the Chinese market. So there is a question mark now as to the speed of growth in production. And I think that's going to be really interesting to watch come next year to see how production fares. Fourth big trend in 2022, and it's not a great one. It shows a lot of the weaknesses in the cashew chain, and that is the fact that raw cashew nut prices have been trading higher, at least in the spot market, higher than kernels prices throughout the year. So this has meant that a number of factories in Vietnam, for example, have closed due to the simple fact that they can't make money. We see that the value chain in cashews, which was already vulnerable and which had big sustainability question marks over it, the costs of the pandemic really bit into that chain. So whereas in 2022 we saw lower kernels prices than we've seen for a long time, we actually saw higher RCN prices on average than in the previous year. So the question that we've got to ask when we look at this is, how sustainable is it? And if you recall, 4 weeks ago, we had a look at the situation in Vietnam and did some rough calculations as to how processing margins might have fared in 2022. And what we could see was that if we take the cost of imported raw cashew nuts and the value of the kernels generated from processing them, the margins were just too thin. The manufacturers need margins, they need gross margins that allow them to make money. Otherwise, they won't be in business. And that's exactly what we've seen. Factories decide that they can close, probably not permanently, but certainly for a period of time, which in turn restricts kernels supply. So it begs the question, are cashew kernels too low? Or you could ask the opposite too. You could ask, are RCN prices too high? Historically, and we'll have a look at that a little bit later, it looks as if the kernels prices are too low. And to a certain extent, we have to accept that this is a self-inflicted wound, that to a certain extent, the structure of the industry, which is essentially designed for the trading of RCN, is somewhat archaic, certainly outdated, and unlikely to be sustainable. And this is where this problem is emanating from. And this has caused changes to processing, and this was a big factor in 2022. So as we know, and as we've discussed many times on this event and elsewhere, we continue to see growth in the volumes of cashews processed, particularly growth in West Africa, but also in East Africa. And that growth in 2022 was quite strong, although it was interrupted by impacts of the pandemic, lower buying volumes in the second half of the year, high RCN prices. Nonetheless, the volumes increased, and I would expect that to continue next year. I show a picture of an empty Vietnamese factory, at least full of machines, but empty of people, in order just to remind us that a lot of factories in Vietnam have adopted this style of flexible processing, let's call it. So as Jasvinder reminded us 2 weeks ago, factories, because they've low level in the numbers of workers, high levels of investment, they close for a few weeks or a few months whilst processing is not profitable. That, of course, makes the supply very difficult to predict. What happens to open contracts when that happens? Are they simply delayed? Or worse, what happens to those workers? Do they end up looking for alternative work? Will they come back to the cashew industry? So it does ask a lot of questions. And we saw a similar situation in India some years ago, and it did eventually change the industry. So it is possible, with few workers and high mechanization, it is possible to close a factory, but it will have long-term impacts. Hopefully those factories will be in a good position to open next year, but that depends on the availability of RCN, which is should be pretty good. The price of the RCN, which I don't see any real reason for that to be an awful lot different than it is today, but mostly it depends on the value of cashew kernels and the price of export cashew kernels for Vietnamese processors. If they can't make money, they won't open, and why should they? If they can't make money and they don't open, that has serious consequences for the industry. And that needs to be considered. If we look at the big trends driving consumption, this is trend number 6. I want to have a look at those big trends driving consumption. And we know about a lot of these. We discussed them with regard to India a couple of weeks back, that health has become a deciding factor in the purchase, particularly of snacks. We see new innovation, new tastes, textures, but we also see corporate social responsibility and sustainability coming to the fore. And this has been beneficial to African cashew processors, closer to markets in the West, more traceable supply chains. And I think the big trend in 2022, of course, none of these things, health being a deciding factor, innovation, taste and texture, corporate responsibility, or sustainability, none of those things are new. But what is becoming more and more a factor is the demand for transparency. What's going on in the supply chain? Who's doing what? What are they being paid? Are their rights being looked after? What's the impact on the environment? And consumers want to know. And not just in markets of Europe, where this trend really started, but also in North America, China, and in India. I show the picture of this. This is a new product launched by Lawrence, European snack food manufacturer. And this product has a number of sustainability claims, but it shows how those are justified. And it tells the story of its sustainability and health claims in a visible, transparent fashion. And this is a big trend in 2022, and it's going to be a bigger trend in the future. And one of the reasons for this is what I'm calling changing buyers' needs. So from the 1st of January, in Germany, we will see the activation of the German Supply Chain Act. That's 24 days from now. The German Supply Chain Act encourages initially large companies, but eventually all companies, to behave responsibly in the supply chain and to be accountable. And that is a word that changes everything. To be accountable for the impact of their activities on the environment and on the human rights of the people, both suppliers, workers, and others involved in the supply chain. And if we look, first of all, to the European Commission of the European Union, there is now on the table a proposal for a similar kind of legislation. That could mean by 2025 that we have laws throughout the European Union, the third largest market in the world, for traceable, sustainable accountability on impact of all kinds of processes. And it seems to me that only origin processed kernels can meet the full requirements. It's very difficult to see how the product that's shipped, first of all, to Vietnam or to India and then shipped back can be fully accountable within this system. If we look in the United States, and sometimes people forget that the United States is also making huge moves in this process. If we look at the rules for public companies, there is now a directive for public companies that they cannot make claims in terms of health, sustainability, environmental impact related to their products unless they can justify those claims. So if you're a major public company in the US at the moment, you should not be making a sustainability claim unless you can back that up. Again, from cashews, I think this comes back to the thought that really, taken to its full accountability, it seems to me that only kernels processed at origin can meet the full requirements, at least as things stand today. So this is a big trend this year. It's something that's been coming for a long time, but once you see it come into law, that tends to stop ideas of being able to pay lip service, greenwashing, all these other phrases which you're probably familiar with from the news media. Allied with that, and maybe related to that, and certainly interestingly, in terms of that trend, we're also seeing African processing catching up. And I think the key thing that I've noticed, it doesn't apply to all processors, but it applies to many. But the key thing that I've noticed is that the cost of processing is coming well within competitiveness ranges. So as we've discussed here on this event more than once in 2022, if we take the cost of processing plus the cost of moving the raw material to market for processing and compare that to the cost of processing in Africa, is African processing competitive? And the answer is yes, it is, at least for some. Mechanization has changed that, better management has changed that, improvements in raw material has changed that. It's been helped with smaller way by taxation on the export of RCN, for example, and in some cases restrictions on the export of RCN. So what we're definitely seeing now is that processing costs in the more efficient factories are coming into line. Premium prices are being paid, but these premium prices represent savings on freight, savings on transit time, but they also represent a better sustainability profile. So a buyer buying in West Africa is pretty sure that the sustainability profile that's claimed for the cashews can be justified. That's a lot more difficult if a processor is processing material that's moved 10,000, 15,000 kilometers around the world to be processed. That is not to say that the RCN trade is going to end quickly. Of course, it's not. It's going to continue for many years. But we're seeing now competitiveness in African processing. So it's not just about subsidies. It's not just about paying lip service to sustainability. It's also now becoming about competitiveness. And companies I work with, processors I'm working with in African countries are telling me that their processing costs are now coming to levels that makes them highly competitive. Big trend. Hopefully, this will continue. If we look in terms of what might be described as a potential for disruption, the trends in regulation. So in 2022, the trend continued for the development of sector policy, regulation, changes in policy around the sector. Particularly, we've seen the development of a new sector policy in Cambodia, which will increase production, stimulate some processing, although I think in Cambodia most people realize that the natural market, for the time being at least, is Vietnam. But it will also change or develop the way that cashews are grown to avoid problems of chemical contamination and other contamination, to make sure that the product remains natural and that the product doesn't suffer from the kind of problems that have beset other products in Southeast Asia, where, for example, high use of pesticides caused problems for, you may know about pepper, and it caused problems for pepper from Vietnam some years ago. Also in Benin, we're seeing big changes. So we saw the introduction of the ban on export of RCN, which now is in a transition phase and which will slowly transition to processing, full processing in Benin. In Ghana, we see the advent for the first time of development and regulation and policy in relation specifically to the cashew sector. And that was seen this year with the first reference pricing, stimulation of production. A lot of work going on in Ghana, and it's certainly going to be a rising force in the cashew sector. And in Tanzania, you may recall some weeks back we had Alfred Francis from the Cashew Board of Tanzania with us, and he confirmed that today, again, a new way of sourcing. Processors can now, rather than being forced to source from the auction, they can source directly from the local cooperatives and farmer groups. It's not fully deregulated, but they can source from them, and that makes processing in Tanzania more competitive. And I can tell you, I'm seeing firsthand evidence of that. So I think we are seeing trends in regulation which are generally toward more regulation, but many of the trends are having a positive impact on the industry. So it has been it's been an unusual year. In a difficult market, we've still seen a lot of the major trends come back into force, having been interrupted during the years of the pandemic. And generally speaking, you would have to say that it has been a year of moving forward, despite the fact that we've seen 10 and at one stage 13-year lows on kernels prices. So let's look forward a little bit, and maybe we'll have a look and we'll see what might be or what will be in 2023. And these are the trends which I think are worth looking out for in the coming year. We'll start with a question, and I think the first question here is, I don't think it's if anymore. I don't think it's if demand will respond to low prices. I think it's how quickly will demand respond to low prices. We've seen in the course of the past 2 years, prices generally drop down. And this has been mainly related to COVID. It's mainly been related to the situation in Vietnam, on which the Chinese market, of course, has had a huge influence. During 2020 and 21, we saw huge buying volumes in markets in the West. In 2022, that eased in Europe and the United States, but major buying returned in India. And so if we look at this, we're looking at a market which today remains, although it's picked up a little bit, remains in the range of the lowest prices we've seen for some 10 years. As we talked about a couple of weeks back, if you recall, we had Case Blockland from Global Trading with us, and we talked about how the market might respond to lower prices, and we thought, definitely, this will stimulate demand in the coming year. And I think particularly in price-sensitive markets. So you may well see spikes in demand in the Middle East, spikes in demand in North America, as low prices start to bite in. Looking at this, every other low price period has been followed by a rally and a high price period. So if you get a low price period followed by any kind of disruption to production, once that demand change has kicked in, you see market volatility. And you've got to say there is a chance of market volatility in 2023, depending on production. So we could say, as I put it, there is possible trouble ahead. And if we look at the situation, we see coming towards the end of 2022, relatively low levels of forward cover compared to what might have been the case 2 or 3 or 5 years ago. We see a situation where inventories, having peaked mid-year, have now been brought under control and have reduced. We see demand returning to the market, and we see low prices. If we put those 4 factors together, it seems likely that prices will start to rise, and we've seen the beginning of that. If that were to be followed by a sharp rise in prices, by contract default, we could see the return of price volatility. But related to our last question, how quickly will demand respond to lower prices, is how quickly is this situation likely to arise? It seems to me that most people will take a look and see how the Northern Hemisphere crops are progressing before they really push into this. But many buyers don't have the choice, especially for the first half of the year. They need to make decisions. They need to buy. You can't wait for a cheaper price if you need product for New Year in China, if you need product for packing starting in June for the peak demand season in North America in 2023. So although people may want to wait and see how the new crop develops, they may also be forced to make moves. And I think we've seen a little bit of that in the past couple of weeks. So what's happened, I think, is a lot of the barriers have been removed. So we see that the easing of COVID restrictions in China. We see the easing of inflation in North America. It's questionable whether or not inflation was likely to have a big impact in the longer term on cashew demand anyway. But certainly I felt all along that the impact was much more likely to be in the boardrooms of the buying and roasting companies than to be on the floors of the supermarkets. Now, with albeit higher interest rates, but with fears of runaway inflation removed, and by now most companies will know what their pattern of demand is likely to be. They'll see this festival season in the US, Thanksgiving followed by Christmas, in Europe, the Christmas season. The impact of that will be known and companies will respond accordingly. If they find that indications for demand are good, if they look at their inventories and find them lower than expected, then we need to be careful. I'm not saying volatility is good, I'm saying volatility is bad news. But I am saying also that kernels prices are too low and we'd like to see kernels prices rise steadily. But sharp rises and falls are not good for anyone. Third big trend for next year is the return of China. Sometimes in the cashew business, we forget how important China is to Vietnam. China can buy 85,000+ tons of cashew kernels every year. It buys them in a pattern of seasonality that's particularly important to Vietnamese suppliers. Delivery in China is fast. Payment is fast, so that it adds a lot of cash flow to the Vietnamese sector. And if we see these reports as being true, if we see them as continuing, if the Chinese government does continue to relax its zero COVID policy, the economy can return to growth, and we could see a serious recovery in buying in China. And I would not be surprised if, once that happens, if we see a serious return of demand growth for a whole range of products, including cashew nuts. It would not be surprising if Chinese demand were to hit 100,000 tons in the coming year and maybe go beyond that. So this is reason for optimism, let's say. Less optimistic, but also a potential trend and a potential threat in the market is the impact of the third year in a row of La Nina. We have seen in the last 2 years impacts on crops. We've seen impacts on the crop in Vietnam, in Cambodia in 2022. We saw impacts on harvests in India, and we have seen throughout 2022 unusually severe weather patterns in Cambodia, in areas of Vietnam. We've seen unusual weather patterns in India. So it is possible that we would see a further impact of this. And this is becoming clear now. We'll know in a few weeks how the crops are looking, and we'll know what to look for. And if we just look how it impacts the different areas in West Africa, it would generally mean cooler than average weather, which may not be ideal for big cashew crops. But the primary impact is going to be, if it happens, is going to be in Southeast Asia, Cambodia, and Vietnam. So Vietnam is a relatively modest producer of cashews these days, but Cambodia is a huge producer. Cambodia this year is probably number 2 in the world after Cote d'Ivoire, and now ahead of India in 2022. And those 3 countries are likely to be the leading producers again next year and for years to come. And between them, we're looking at somewhere in the region of 2.4, 2.5 million tons between those 3 countries out of an overall production just above 4 million tons. So hugely significant. Any problem in Cambodia, any problem in India is going to have a knock-on effect, and that needs to be watched carefully. And if you look at that negative impact, and if you go back, if you know your history of cashew prices, you will see that there were 1998, 99, huge price spikes in the market, 2010, same thing again, We didn't see it in 2021 because the damage was not enough and it didn't affect West African production. Could we see it in the future? Well, we need to watch that one closely. Fifth trend we're looking at in 2023, which has already started and is likely to continue, is more value added from Vietnam. So we're going to see more cashews, roasted, salted, consumer packed in Vietnam. You see a branded pack on the left. On the right-hand side, you see an own label brand. This one is a product that's sold in Australia, and you can see packed in Vietnam from imported and local ingredients. This is going to be a trend, and this is the way that Vietnam can move on to the next stage in its development as a processor of cashew nuts. So maybe the trend becomes, let's process less, but let's add more value. And that's being encouraged by recent trade agreements signed with the European Union, for example. That trend is also present in African countries. We are seeing more processed product from certain countries, from Côte d'Ivoire, for example. And there is an opportunity in that. It does require more investment. It requires quite a long and difficult process to get there, but it does enhance value. So secondary processing from Vietnam, I think that's going to be an increasing trend from 2023 into the future. Trend number 6, looking back at, again, these issues of biorequirements. And I want to ask the question, which I've previously asked here and elsewhere: what would the average cashew consumer think if they knew how the business works? So picture someone, for example, in a market, picture someone in Germany. Young person, highly motivated by sustainability, highly motivated by healthy choices in food. They look at cashews, they see a healthy product. They have a rough idea where it comes from. They think this is a good product. It's good for the planet, it's good for the person. What would they think if they knew that it moves 28,000 kilometers before it gets to them? What would they think if they knew some of the working conditions in some of the factories around the world? It wouldn't be good news. So the realignment or the alignment with the sector with consumer demands is a huge trend. And now, as I mentioned earlier, it's becoming part of the law. So the main areas, so if we look at areas like the quality of the product, well, that's pretty much under control, particularly with African processors. We see some great product coming out. But we don't see a resilient, diversified, short supply chain. We see a vulnerable, long supply chain, highly dependent on Vietnam as the processor. 80% of cashews consumed in Europe, 89% of cashews consumed in the United States are processed in Vietnam, or were processed in Vietnam in 2021. We don't see traceability and transparency. And this is linked to the quality of the product, and it's linked to food safety, and it's linked to labor and environmental compliance. So the market is likely to come into line with consumer demands. What's the alternative? The alternative is actually to go out of business. Because unless you're in line with what the consumer wants, you're not going to be selling product. Now, in Africa, processors are in a relatively good position to take advantage of this trend because there is a much shorter supply chain, traceability is easier, the quality of the product, food safety, labor and environmental compliance, well, that is in the hands of the individual processors, their suppliers, and regulators. So it is possible for Africa to quickly align with consumer demands. And as I mentioned, with costs of processing coming into line, certainly we could get into a position where we see Africa being the only origin, or at least some African countries being the only origin that can fully comply with consumer demands in the future. So you might feel this has been talked about for 20 years, and it's true, it has been talked about for 20 years. What makes a difference now is, like food safety 20 years ago, it's now becoming part of the law. And once it becomes part of the law, there is no way back. And that means we all have to get our businesses into gear to comply with what consumers want and what the law says we must do in order to protect the consumer, in the case of food safety, and protect the planet, but also all of the workers, suppliers, processors in that chain. This is a big trend. This is going to have a huge impact in the coming years. Trend number 7, I just want to draw your attention to this. It's not a huge factor for cashew nuts right now. Maybe it will be in the future. Water. Sometimes we don't think about water as part of sustainability, but read about almonds. Here's an article from a Sacramento newspaper published, I think, by the INC. In this case, it was extracted. And it looks at the problem that water, and I'll just quote from it, water, or rather the lack of it, is a matter of continued heated debate in California. That the water available for the production of nuts in California, according to this article, is way below, it says 5%, but it's hard to imagine that, but it's way, way below what's needed to continue production in the current way. That puts the production of almonds, for example, as mentioned in this article, in California, in Spain, because of drought, because of higher production costs, puts those businesses in jeopardy. And this is something that, okay, in the cashew sector today is not a huge issue, but we're all part of the greater edible nuts market. If edible nuts gets a bad reputation for sustainability, cashews won't be immune from that. If we can show that the use of water in the production of cashew nuts is demonstrably lower than other nuts, it can create a competitive advantage. This is going to be a big trend going forward. We may not see it in cashews right now, but we will see it at some point in the future. So coming towards the last few trends for 2023, I think there is a potential here for disruption of the sector by additional regulation. So earlier we mentioned the trends in regulation. We've seen in 2022 greater examples of changes in policy, development in regulation. And I've personally been doing a lot of work and research on this recently as part of the Pro Cashew project in West Africa with USAID and CNFA. And there is a question here, as we see a market possibly returning to higher prices next year, and that will happen in the course of the year, how will regulators deal with that transition? I think this is a big question. How will they deal with the transition back toward higher level of prices? How will they deal with the misalignment of RCN prices and kernels? Regulators have a really tough time because they've got to make decisions on farm gate prices in West Africa in January and February in a market that at that time may well be quite volatile. And if it's not volatile at that time, the prospect of greater volatility is there later in the year. In some countries, these are very new policies. Some of the instruments in terms of reference pricing and minimum pricing have only just been introduced in some countries. So there is not experience in carrying out this work. And the risks are huge. If you set the price too low, the farmer is not properly rewarded. That can have long-term impacts on production. If you set the price too high, either the product doesn't move or people trade outside the law, neither of which is good news. Particularly the first case, if the product wasn't to move to market, the weakest, poorest segment in the whole cashew market, the grower, would suffer. So regulators have a big job. Errors in this area can potentially disrupt the market. They can delay harvests. They can delay delivery of product to the market. And it's all the more difficult when the supply chain is so long and the destination processors are so far away. So I think we all have a part to play in trying to assist, provide information, and bring these conversations into play. So I'll just finish this looking forward with a question, which I'll try to answer. So again, are we at a crossroads for sustainable sourcing? So I mean that is sourcing by major buyers of cashews around the world in all the major markets, is it changing towards sustainability? And this has the potential, as I've mentioned, to bring African cashews to the forefront. And I think we're saying the answer to that is yes, that potential is there. But we would still see in general conversations with investors, with buyers, and I'd ask these two questions. Are buyers and investors well enough informed about what, well enough informed about the opportunity in the African cashew sector? Some are, but the general answer to that question is no, they're not well enough informed. Over the years, with so much effort on policy, so much effort on production, so much effort to try and get processors into line, somehow buyers have been a little bit neglected. Secondly, is it a fact that many of the stakeholders in the cashew business, in the cashew chain, think too short term? And I think this is a real problem. If you invest in processing, this is not something, it's not like trading. It's not something that gives you return in 6 weeks or even in a year. It's something that develops over a period of time. And any successful processor will tell you that. They'll tell you how long it took them to get to profitability and how tough it is to get there. But that when you get there, it can be quite a successful and rewarding business. So there's no doubt that, in my opinion, we are at a crossroads. We have been, it was interrupted by the pandemic, but we have been for some years, where sustainable sourcing is bringing African cashews to the forefront. But to develop that, particularly processing, but not only processing, also methods of production and production itself, it needs greater education and greater technical support. So it's happening, but it's happening slowly. So when we look at these trends, and I've given you 9 potential trends for 2023, the outlook is quite optimistic. There are a couple of possible problems, but they're part of agriculture. Weather, climate, these are always issues that are faced in chains like ours. Perhaps one thing that isn't is this rather illogical low price for kernels, and maybe that will change in 2023. But generally, I think there's an optimistic outlook, and I think we can go into the year looking for better times. So let me stop talking and let's turn to our guest today. Andre, are you with us?
Oui, bonjour, James. Est-ce que vous m'entendez?
Yes, can hear you very well. Good morning, how are you?
Oui, je vais très bien et j'espère que vous allez également très bien.
I am indeed. Thanks very much indeed. It's great for you to join us. Thank you very much indeed for giving your time.
Ok, c'est moi qui vous remercie.
Okay, let me just remind our participants that the interpretation channels are available. You can find those on your screen and choose the language of your choice. Andre, it's been quite a year. It's been quite a tumultuous period for the cashew sector. with the pandemic, economic uncertainty, war in Europe. How do you see things? How do you see the opportunity for African cashews as we come to the end of 2022?
Oui, mais merci beaucoup, Gilles. Et d'abord, je voudrais remercier l'Alliance africaine de cajou pour cette initiative de mise à jour régulière des informations sur le secteur du cajou. Pour le CICC, cela permet d'avoir une lecture du secteur et de pouvoir se faire une opinion et forger également des options pour sa stratégie. Donc, je voudrais aussi remercier Plessis pour m'avoir invité à cette séance-là. Merci également à Jim pour toutes ces analyses que vous partagez, des analyses qui sont vraiment très, très intéressantes et qui profitent à tous les intervenants du secteur. Donc, c'est avec beaucoup de plaisir que je suis dans ce forum régulièrement, de temps à autre bien sûr, mais particulièrement dans le forum d'aujourd'hui qui fait la synthèse de 2022 avec la projection sur 2023. Pour revenir à votre première question, je voudrais d'emblée vous dire que la pandémie à COVID-19 a affecté le monde global du secteur de l'Afrique, le secteur mondial bien sûr, et particulièrement l'Afrique. Mais pour ma part, il a permis d'expérimenter de nouvelles relations d'affaires. Par exemple, les questions de négociation à distance. Il faut savoir qu'avec la pandémie, les hommes ne pouvaient pas se déplacer. Donc, il faut trouver un mécanisme pour continuer de négocier. Ça a permis également de renforcer la confiance dans la contractualisation. Si vous ne pouvez pas vous déplacer pour aller d'un point A à un point B, donc vous êtes obligé de mettre en exergue beaucoup plus l'accent sur la confiance qui doit exister entre les partenaires. C'est également l'importance de la chaîne logistique qui est sortie comme expérience partagée au cours de cette pandémie. On a compris également que cette pandémie a été une opportunité pour expérimenter beaucoup plus ou mettre l'accent sur les questions de digitalisation, notamment dans les partages de connaissances comme ce que James est en train de faire depuis un bon bout de temps et comme ce qu'on a pu expérimenter dans d'autres contextes où l'Alliance africaine de cajou a fait au moins 2 conférences en ligne. Donc, c'est la digitalisation qui a permis ça. Donc, c'est une autre forme d'apprentissage. C'est également cette digitalisation qui a permis de renforcer également les flux d'échanges monétaires ou d'échanges financiers entre les acteurs qui sont dans le secteur. Donc, nous avions beaucoup tiré de cette expérience de COVID, comme je viens de l'annoncer. Donc, la liste est encore longue, mais on ne peut pas tout embrasser. Donc, partant de ce constat, je trouve que les perspectives sont très bonnes pour le cajou africain, suite aux leçons tirées et les expériences vécues par chacun des acteurs. Mais grosso modo, qu'est-ce qu'il faut retenir pour ma part? Le producteur et le consommateur comprennent davantage qu'ils doivent réduire la longueur des chaînes des échanges, notamment pour ce qui concerne l'Afrique. Il faut être présent sur le marché, directement sur le marché où on consomme le produit. Pour le consommateur, il faut s'approvisionner très proche pour gagner du temps. Et je pense que c'est ressorti dans la présentation de James. Et également la question de consommation des produits bien tracés. Et je pense que dans les derniers points de James, j'ai retrouvé cet élément que ce que nous voulons consommer, nous voulons savoir d'où ça provient et comment c'est fait et ainsi de suite. Donc, c'est des questions qui sont des questions d'opportunité et je pense que l'Afrique, les pays africains réunissent suffisamment d'arguments pour adresser ces questions-là. Donc, si je dois me résumer sur la question pandémique, je dirais que ça a permis d'élever la conscience que des mesures doivent être prises pour que la croissance des volumes d'amendes sur le continent soit de plus en plus grande pour aboutir à ce rêve que tous les pays africains ou tous les jeunes pays qui arrivent dans le secteur du cajou ont, de pouvoir transformer en totalité leur production et de les mettre directement sur le marché.
Thanks, Andre. Very interesting perspective. But I'd like to come to the CICC itself. We see how international cooperation is a real driver of economic development. CICC is centrally involved in that. What progress on cooperation has been made since CICC was established?
Oui, merci beaucoup, Jim, pour cette question de coopération. Et quand vous regardez un peu, vous regardez le concept du CICC, la coopération est l'un des 5 piliers de ce concept-là. Donc, c'est au centre de ce dispositif du CICC. Oui, le monde, de mon point de vue, le monde se portera mieux dans une coopération à l'échelle nationale, également à l'échelle régionale et à l'échelle internationale. Pour ma part, au CICC, je vois 3 et 4 niveaux de coopération sur lesquels je voudrais mettre un accent et peut-être toucher un peu du doigt ce que peut-être le CICC a pu y contribuer au niveau de ces choses. Donc, le premier niveau de coopération, c'est la coopération entre les pays. Et cet élément est très, très important en ce sens que cette coopération permet de partager. Et quand on partage, on permet à quelqu'un qui démarre d'aller plus vite dans l'exercice. Je pense que les quelques années d'expérience avec le CICC, cette coopération s'est de plus en plus renforcée. Et l'exemple que je donnerai, tout juste pour illustrer, c'est les événements nationaux organisés, par exemple le Cashiou au Bénin et prochainement, peut-être dans les semaines à venir, le Cashiou au Nigeria, où les acteurs des autres pays, que ce soit privés ou publics, sont dans ces assises pour partager leurs expériences et permettre également à un pays d'apprendre et d'autres qui sont venus sur ces marchés également d'apprendre. Donc, c'est un élément très, très important. Toutes mes excuses. Également, je mettrai qu'on appelle, donner l'exemple de l'expérience du Burkina Faso avec la création du Conseil burkinabé du Cajou, qui est une inspiration de ce qui s'est passé les années antérieures au niveau de la Côte d'Ivoire en termes d'organisation. Et il a fallu que cette assemblée de CICC existe pour que les acteurs comprennent que nous pouvons apprendre quelque chose des uns et l'expérimenter, même si tout ne doit pas être reproduit dans les pays où ça doit être expérimenté. Le troisième élément, c'est dans cette coopération entre pays, c'est tout ce qui permet, par exemple, de mettre à disposition du matériel végétal, le matériel de plantation, pour permettre à des pays nouveaux de pouvoir avancer très vite et de ne plus recommencer. Je prends l'exemple du Ghana qui a pu donner ou pu mettre à disposition du matériel végétal au Togo, à la Guinée et à d'autres pays pour leur permettre d'avancer à partir de ce que les Ghanéens ont déjà eu comme expérience en matière de développement de matériel végétal. Donc, dans cette coopération pays, des lignes ont bougé. Le deuxième niveau de coopération, c'est cette coopération entre les acteurs privés. L'exemple que je vous donnerai, c'est un peu ce qui s'est passé ces dernières années en Côte d'Ivoire, où pour lever des fonds, des acteurs privés se sont donné la main, que ce soit à l'international comme au niveau local, pour adresser la problématique de transformation de noix de cajou en Côte d'Ivoire. Et c'est ça qui a permis à la Côte d'Ivoire aujourd'hui d'atteindre les près de 170 000 tonnes de noix brutes transformées et se positionner comme le troisième pays exportateur des amandes au monde. Donc, cette coopération privée-privée, c'est quelque chose qu'il faut souhaiter et sur un chantier sur lequel il faut travailler. Le troisième niveau de coopération, c'est la coopération entre les acteurs privés et le public. Et l'exemple que je donnerai, juste pour illustrer, c'est un peu ce qui se passe présentement au Bénin avec la promotion de la zone industrielle de Glodibé, qui est un concept nouveau qui arrive dans le secteur du cajou où un État accepte de partager des risques qu'on imagine dans le secteur de transformation avec des privés. Et les privés dont il s'agit ici, je pense qu'on en a suffisamment parlé dans les anciennes présentations de James, c'est Harris qui est dans ce secteur au niveau de cajou au Bénin. Donc, cette coopération entre État et public est une tendance qui va certainement faire tache d'huile et va évoluer avec l'appui du CICC. Et le dernier élément de coopération ou le dernier niveau de coopération, c'est la coopération entre les partenaires. Il faut dire que les partenaires qui accompagnent les pays ou qui accompagnent les acteurs doivent être dans ce mode de synergie. Synergie pour maximiser les impacts de leurs interventions et également pour assurer les questions de durabilité. Je pense que dans la présentation de James, la question de durabilité est arrivée et nous pensons que le CICC est très, très attentif à ces questions-là. Donc, pour me résumer, sur cette question que vous venez de me poser, je retiens grosso modo que 6 ans après la création du CICC, les lignes ont bougé sur ces 4 niveaux de coopération au niveau, comment on appelle, des pays concernés par le CICC et particulièrement par le biais des apprentissages qu'on peut apprendre d'un pays à l'autre, d'une organisation à une autre, d'un secteur privé ou du public à un autre.
Thank you, Andre. It's really interesting what you're saying, and it's really interesting to see that so much progress has been made. Could I just mention to our interpreters, we seem to have 2 voices on the English interpretation at the moment. You might want to just consider to fix that. Andre, thank you for that really comprehensive answer. It puts me in mind of the question with regard to the harmonization of policy or regulation across countries. Is it possible? Is it even desirable that we would have harmonized policies across the region between different countries?
OK, merci beaucoup. Bon, je voudrais profiter pour peut-être clarifier un peu ici que le CICC n'est pas exclusif à l'Afrique et non plus à l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Le CICC est ouvert à tous les pays producteurs, à tous les pays transformateurs et tous les pays consommateurs. Vous voyez, les mesures prises ailleurs dans le monde impactent inévitablement l'Afrique et le monde du cajou, comme vous pouvez le savoir. Et l'exemple que Jim a donné tout à l'heure sur la loi allemande qui arrivera en vigueur à partir du 1er janvier 2023 et ne serait pas sans impact également sur le reste du monde et particulièrement sur les pays africains qui sont également dans le secteur du cajou. Mais la question politique ou réglementaire concerne toutes les grandes régions du monde, et l'Afrique ou l'Afrique de l'Ouest n'en dérobera point. Donc, ça nous concerne. Donc, pour revenir au cas ouest-africain évoqué, je pense que l'harmonisation de politique est souhaitable et même nécessaire. Mais je suis conscient que cela passera par des étapes au cours desquelles des points de convergence seront recherchés et consolidés pour adresser cette étape ou aller à l'étape d'harmonisation qui est souhaitée et envisagée. Comme vous le savez, l'harmonisation est nécessaire à cause, sinon, l'évolution en étape dans l'harmonisation est nécessaire à cause, d'une part, dans un premier temps, des expériences diversifiées des pays qui ne sont pas au même niveau d'organisation, par exemple, et qui n'ont pas les mêmes expériences en termes dans le secteur du cajou. C'est également les contextes politiques et économiques qui sont variables d'un pays à un autre. Et pour vous donner un exemple, dans nombre de pays ouest-africains, je ne vais pas les citer tout de suite, le cajou est un produit géopolitique important, géopolitique national important, et c'est regardé avec beaucoup plus d'attention. Donc, tous ces paramètres, c'est des éléments qu'il faut prendre en compte et travailler à petit feu et pour les adresser. L'autre élément également, c'est le niveau d'organisation des acteurs. Je l'ai dit, si je prends la Côte d'Ivoire et je prends la Guinée, vous n'avez pas le même niveau d'organisation. Si je prends le Bénin et peut-être un autre pays par hasard, le niveau qu'on appelle le niveau de décision, si je puisse le dire ainsi, de décision politique, ce n'est pas la même. Donc, il faut regarder ces éléments avec beaucoup plus d'attention. L'autre élément également, c'est la prise en compte des différentes forces d'intérêt. Dans le secteur du cajou, vous le savez très bien, les forces d'intérêt sont là, que ces forces soient au niveau national, au niveau régional ou au niveau international, ces forces sont là et il faut les prendre en compte. Mais pour ma part, pour revenir au cas, à la question spécifique, l'une des étapes qui me paraît prioritaire, qui doit être des questions à aborder tout de suite, ou dans une échéance courte, c'est la question des prix. Et je pense que dans la présentation de tout à l'heure, j'en ai entendu parler, c'est la question des prix, c'est la question des tasses, c'est la question, par exemple, du resserrement des dates d'ouverture des campagnes. si vous prenez les périodes de lancement des campagnes en Afrique de l'Ouest, par exemple, vous trouverez, par exemple, que pendant que la campagne est lancée au mois de janvier ou au mois de février, quelque part, c'est lancé au mois de mars, quelque part. Donc, il faut resserrer cette date-là de façon à maximiser les efforts et canaliser les acteurs pour leur permettre de tirer plus d'opportunités dans la convention pour éviter que cette gestion de certains acteurs qui surfent sur la date en retard des uns pour jouer sur les prix des autres ne soit plus quelque chose soit devienne quelque chose suffisamment amoindri. Il y a également les échanges de matières premières entre pays qui doivent être facilités. Si je prends par exemple un pays comme la Côte d'Ivoire, pourquoi ne pas faciliter ou trouver un mécanisme qui permet au Ghana, qui a peut-être des installations sur place, peut-être, c'est un exemple que je donne comme ça, d'avoir les noix, de permettre à un pays qui peut-être en 2024, comme le Bénin, qui aurait peut-être atteint la totalité de sa transformation. Par exemple, si cette réalité est vraie ou devienne une réalité, que la production d'un autre pays ne passe à ce pays pour être transformée et permettre à la valeur ajoutée d'être dans l'espace. Donc, c'est des choses qu'il faut regarder de façon attentive. Et oui, pour répondre à votre question, harmonisation, oui, mais avec des étapes et des mécanismes pour aller à ce rêve.
Yeah, certainly. That makes a lot of sense what you're saying, Andre. I think it is. It's a big challenge, though. I'm sure you'd agree that particularly the exchange or the trade in raw material cross borders presents great challenges. Differences in tax systems and export regimes, and the fact that many growing areas, the most logical port of export, for example, is in a neighboring country. This is a great challenge for the future, I think. But you've made a very comprehensive answer to the question. So it's been really interesting listening to you. We're coming towards the end of today's session, the last session of the year. So let me ask you one final question, Andre. If you had one wish for the African cashew sector in 2023, what would that be?
Oui, merci. Oui. Dans un premier temps, nous devons changer le paradigme de l'Afrique qui est pourvoyeuse à près de 90% de noix brutes à d'autres régions pour qu'elles prennent de la valeur ajoutée pour autres régions. Donc, ce paradigme doit être changé avec une mobilisation d'investissements privés avec une garantie de leur sécurisation avec des mesures fortes apportées par les États dans les pays. Ça, c'est un souhait et je pense qu'au vu des tendances aujourd'hui, les discours politiques, c'est quelque chose sur lequel il faut travailler et ce rêve doit pouvoir être une réalité pour question de durabilité même du secteur. Le deuxième élément qui, de mon point de vue, c'est de travailler en synergie pour des mesures réglementaires très fortes qui sécurisent également ou donnent la priorité à la transformation domestique. Et parce qu'un privé qui met son argent quelque part doit avoir cette garantie que les fonds doivent pouvoir se reproduire et générer de la valeur ajoutée. Donc, prendre des mesures qui garantissent ça là, c'est mon rêve et je pense que ce rêve doit pouvoir être partagé par tous les acteurs qui vivent qui souhaitent que le secteur du cajou puisse prospérer. Le dernier, de mon point de vue, c'est le travail en synergie de tous les intervenants dans le secteur pour maximiser les impacts et rendre durable tout ce qu'il y a comme initiative prise. Je veux parler des questions politiques. Qu'est-ce que nous faisons dans les questions politiques et que nous faisons ensemble? Qu'est-ce que nous faisons en matière d'investissement et que nous faisons ensemble? Qu'est-ce que nous faisons en termes de renforcement des capacités des acteurs ou même des États qui ont besoin de connaissances pour adresser un certain nombre de choses? Qu'est-ce que nous faisons et comment nous le faisons ensemble? Donc, je pense que les intervenants doivent sortir, ça je le dis humblement, de leur coin pour expérimenter d'autres approches innovantes qui permettent de collaborer et de collaborer de façon transparente et pour permettre également que tout ce qu'il y a comme initiative prise ou intervention dans le secteur puisse connaître des impacts et des impacts rapides et durables.
Wonderful, Andre. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you very much for your contribution. We've been listening to Andre Tanjapon of the Consultative International Cashew Council, and thank you very much to him. So it's the last session of 2022. We will be back in January. As it is the last session, I would like to extend my thanks to the African Cashew Alliance, all of the sponsors of this event, particularly to Blessing, who has done so much work for this event and done it very well. I'd like to thank all of our contributors. We've had a number of fascinating guests in 2022. They've really done a great job. Andre, today you've done a really terrific job for us, and we thank you for that. We wish you continued success at CICC. I would like to thank all of our technical support, and particularly the interpreters who've had to put up with me every 2 weeks over the past year. And I would most of all like to thank all of the participants, all of those people who've shared this event live or online on one of the platforms, on YouTube, on Facebook, on Microsoft Teams. Thank you all very much indeed. I wish you all the very best for 2023. And I'll pass you back to Blessing.
Thank you very much, Jim, for the delivery of another session of the ACA Global Market Encounter. It's been a year. We've had 16 editions. And of course, a big thank you to Andre Tanjapon, Executive Secretary of the Consultative International Cashew Council, and all the guests who have passed on the screen to be with Jim at the ACA Global Market Encounter. We want to especially appreciate our sponsors and our partners, Intersnack, CNFA Pro Cashew, GIZ Move, SNI, just to mention a few, who have made it possible for us to bring this event every 2 weeks. While this is the last session of the ACA Global Market Encounter for 2022, we are bringing your way a special technical session with Shakti Pal next Wednesday, the 14th of December at 9 a.m. And where we'll be talking about GDIZ Benin, a unique business opportunity in cashew processing at origin. Joining Shakti at this session is the CDO of GDIZ Arise, Jasveer Singh, and the time is 9 a.m. as mentioned. I'll be sharing with you all in the chat box the login details. We ask that you register so that reminders are sent to you before Wednesday next week. We invite you to like, follow, and subscribe to our social media channels, Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube at African Cashew Alliance, where you'll be updated on ACA's activities, industry activities, and of course, rewatch all the sessions of the Global Market Encounter. Dear participants, we would like to thank you all for joining us throughout each session. And as we bring 2022 Global Market Encounter, we ask for your input. Let us know what you want us to address in the coming sessions as we prepare. And we look forward to hosting you next week at the special session with Shakti Pal. Stay safe and bye-bye.
Africa. A continent thriving with opportunities. 70% of the world's cocoa, 53% of the world's cashew. The resource-rich continent is at a turning point. By 2030, Africa will be home to 20% of the world's population and 75% of people aged under 35. Yet, across the continent, some dynamics